Dawn broke over Silver Winds Airport with the same manufactured brightness that characterized all hours within its climate-controlled confines. Mauricio arrived 30 minutes before his shift, his steps quickening as he approached Gate 23. His breath caught slightly when he saw the familiar figure still occupying the same seat, the roses now showing visible signs of wilting, their once proud heads drooping toward the floor. The elderly gentleman's suit, though still neat, had acquired the slightly rumpled look of clothes worn too long. His silver hair, meticulously combed yesterday, now showed signs of restless hands running through it. Dark circles had formed under his eyes, suggesting he hadn't left for rest or respite during the night shift. Mauricio's concern crystallized into something more urgent. He approached the man, pulling off his security cap in a gesture of respect. "Good morning, sir. I noticed you've been waiting here for quite some time. Is everything all right?" The elderly man looked up, recognition flickering in his tired eyes. When he spoke, his voice carried the cultured tones of someone well-educated, though fatigue had roughened its edges. "Ah, yes, the young officer from yesterday. Good morning to you, too. I'm perfectly fine, thank you. Just waiting for flight 335. Something in the way he said the flight number made Mauricio's security training kick in. "Flight 335, sir? May I ask where it's arriving from?" "Buenos Aires," the man replied, straightening his tie with fingers that trembled slightly. "My Alejandra is coming. She's had some delays with her medical arrangements, but she assured me she would be here." He patted the seat beside him, an invitation that Mauricio accepted after a moment's hesitation. "I'm Geraldo," the elderly man offered, extending a hand that Mauricio shook carefully, noting its slight chill. "Geraldo Mendez. And you are?" "Mauricio Santos, sir. Airport security." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Mr. Mendez, how long exactly have you been waiting?" Geraldo's face creased in thought. "Well, let's see. I arrived early Tuesday morning. Alejandra said she might be on any of the Buenos Aires flights, so I've been checking each one. She has to be careful, you see, with her condition and the treatment she needs." Tuesday morning. Mauricio felt his stomach tighten. It was now Thursday. The elderly man had been in the airport for nearly 3 days. "She's such a remarkable woman," Geraldo continued, his face softening with affection. "A medical researcher, you know. We met through an online support group for classical music enthusiasts. She has such insight into box compositions. We've been corresponding for 2 years now." As Geraldo spoke, sharing details of his online romance with increasing animation, Mauricio felt a growing sense of dread. The story emerged in pieces, the gradual deepening of their connection, the shared appreciation for music and literature, the eventual confession of Alejandra's medical struggles with an unspecified condition that required expensive experimental treatment. She was so reluctant to accept help, Geraldo explained, pride evident in his voice. "But when I insisted, well, I've been blessed with good savings. 33,000 reis isn't too much to help someone you love, is it?" Mauricio's trained calm nearly cracked at the figure. "Sir, this money, you haven't sent it to her yet, have you?" "Oh, no." Geraldo patted his jacket pocket. "She was very specific. Said it needed to be in cash because of the way the medical facility processes payments. I'm to give it to her representative who's coming with her. They've arranged everything very carefully." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Mauricio had seen similar scenarios before, though never with such an elaborate setup or such a vulnerable target. His mind raced through protocol options while Geraldo continued to speak, describing the future he had planned. With Alejandra. Quiet evenings discussing music, trips to concerts, maybe even a small wedding once her health improved. Each word twisted the knife deeper in Mauricio's heart. The hope in Geraldo's voice, the careful planning evident in every detail of his appearance, the roses selected with such thought, all of it designed to be crushed by criminals who saw only an opportunity in a lonely man's desire for connection. "Mr. Mendez." Mauricio began gently, but was interrupted by Geraldo's sudden movement. "Oh, another flight's arriving." The elderly man stood, adjusting his suit jacket with trembling hands. "This could be her, Mauricio. She said she'd know me by the roses." What do you think? Should I hold them higher? The eagerness in his voice made Mauricio's decision for him. He wouldn't, let this man's heart be broken in the middle of a crowded airport. Not when he had the power to prevent it. Mr. Mendez, please sit down for a moment. I need to check something with our flight information desk. Will you wait here for me? Just for a few minutes? Geraldo nodded, distracted by watching the passengers emerging from the latest arrival. Mauricio stood, already reaching for his radio as he walked briskly toward the security office. This would require careful handling and multiple departments, but he was determined to protect this gentleman who had spent 3 days waiting with roses for a love that existed only in cruel imagination. The weight of what he had to do, explaining to Geraldo that his Alejandra was a fiction, that his love had been manipulated for profit, sat heavy in his chest. But as he glanced back at the elderly man still watching the arrival gate with such hope, Mauricio knew that preventing the financial loss was only part of his duty. The harder task would be helping Geraldo preserve his dignity and, somehow, his faith in human connection. He keyed his radio, speaking quietly but firmly. "Control, this is Santos. I need a team at Gate 23. Possible fraud in progress, elderly target. Suspects may be incoming." And he paused, watching Geraldo adjust his roses once more. "We're going to need victim services on standby. This one's going to be rough." The security office erupted into controlled chaos as soon as Mauricio pushed through the door. Elena was already mobilizing a response team, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she accessed the airport's extensive camera network. The familiar click-clack of her typing provided a steady backbeat to the tension filling the room. "Got everything on cameras going back 3 days," she announced, her screen displaying multiple angles of Gate 23. "Runtime analysis shows our gentleman hasn't left that spot for more than 15 minutes at a time. 3 days, Mauricio. How did we miss this?" Mauricio ran his fingers through his hair, a habit that betrayed his agitation. "We're trained to look for suspicious behavior, Elena. What's suspicious about Hope?" He leaned over her shoulder, studying the footage. "Can you pull up arrival patterns for flights from Buenos Aires?" "Already on it." Another officer, Rafael, called from his station. "There's been no flight 335 from Buenos Aires in our system for the past week. Not even a delayed or canceled one." He swiveled in his chair, his expression grim. This is textbook romance scam escalation. They've probably been grooming him for months, building trust, creating a whole fictional life. And now they're coming to collect, Mauricio finished, his jaw tightening. But they made one mistake. They got greedy. Instead of just asking for wire transfers, they wanted the whole amount in cash. That means they have to show up in person. The room's atmosphere shifted as this sank in. Wire transfers were nearly impossible to trace. But physical encounters? Those they could handle. Elena's fingers resumed their dance across the keyboard, pulling up passenger manifests for incoming flights. "We need to assume they're watching him," she said, her dark eyes never leaving the screen. "They've invested too much time in this setup to just walk away from 33,000 reais. They'll have someone monitoring him, probably from multiple positions." Mauricio nodded, already scanning the security feeds. "Look for anyone who's been maintaining sight lines to Gate 23. Anyone who's stayed too long, moved when he moves, or shown unusual interest in an elderly man with roses." The next hour passed in a blur of tactical planning and surveillance coordination. Security teams were strategically positioned throughout the terminal, dressed as travelers, maintenance workers, and shop employees. Every angle was covered, every potential escape route monitored. But even as they prepared for the operation, Mauricio's thoughts kept returning to Geraldo, still sitting at Gate 23 with his wilting roses and unwavering faith. The technical aspects of catching the criminals were straightforward enough. It was the human element that threatened to overwhelm him. "How do you tell someone that their heart has been gambling chips in someone else's game?" he asked softly, not really expecting an answer. Elena paused in her typing, looking up at him with understanding. "You do it the same way you're handling everything else about this case, Mauricio, with compassion and professionalism." The radio crackled to life. "Movement at Gate 25. Male subject, mid-30s, business attire, has made 3 passes by the target in the last 10 minutes. Shows pattern recognition behavior. Another voice joined in. Confirmation on subject 2, female, approaching from opposite direction. Professional dress, carrying medical-style briefcase. Matches known scammer profiles. Mauricio straightened, his training taking over. All units maintain position. Let them make the approach. We need clear intent. He adjusted his earpiece, making sure he could hear every transmission clearly. Elena, I want every camera on this. Raphael, alert airport police. Have them ready but out of sight. This needs to look natural until the last possible moment. Through the security feeds, they watched as the drama began to unfold. The male subject was now seated 2 rows behind Geraldo, ostensibly reading a newspaper, but clearly monitoring the area. The woman with the briefcase had positioned herself near a coffee shop, occasionally checking her phone while maintaining clear sight lines to their target. They're professionals, Raphael observed. Look at their positioning. Perfect triangulation, multiple escape routes covered. They've done this before. Well, this is their last performance, Mauricio said firmly. He watched as a third subject entered the frame. This one moving with the practiced casualness of someone trying very hard to look natural. There's our closer. Elena, give me everything you can on known associates matching these descriptions. I want to know if we're dealing with a local crew or international. The woman at the coffee shop touched her ear briefly, a telltale sign of communication equipment. Moments later, both she and the man with the newspaper began to move, their movements synchronized in a way that would be invisible to anyone not trained to look for it. They're starting, Mauricio announced into his radio. All units hold positions. Wait for my signal. He turned to Elena. Keep the cameras rolling. We're going to want every angle of this for prosecution. Through the monitors, they watched as the third subject approached Geraldo directly, while the other 2 maintained their positions as cutoffs for any potential interference. The man was good, his body language was open, his smile genuine seeming, his hand extended in greeting before he even reached Geraldo's seat. Mauricio felt his heart clench as he saw Geraldo stand, hope radiating from every line of his body. The roses, though wilted, were held proudly now, their fading blooms a testament to 3 days of unwavering. No defy. Signal when they show credentials or mention money, Elena reminded him softly. We need clear evidence of intent. But Mauricio's attention was fixed on Geraldo's face, watching as the elderly man's expression shifted from hope to confusion to the beginning of understanding. The third subject was speaking now, gesturing to the briefcase his female accomplice was bringing over, his manner professional and reassuring. Then Geraldo reached for his jacket pocket, where Mauricio knew he kept the envelope containing his life savings. And it was time. All units move in. Targets are active. Remember, civilian protection is priority 1. Mauricio was already moving, heading for the terminal at a controlled run. Airport police, take up containment positions. Nobody exits that area without clearance. Behind him, he could hear Elena coordinating the response teams, her voice steady and clear. Target 1 moving southeast. Target 2 maintaining position. Target 3 is attempting to disengage, moving towards exit C. But Mauricio's focus had narrowed to a single goal, reaching Geraldo before the full impact of the betrayal could hit him. He knew from experience that the next few moments would be crucial, not just for apprehending the criminals, but for preserving something far more fragile than any amount of money. The roses would wilt and fade, their petals scattering across the airport floor like broken promises. But with proper care and understanding, perhaps Geraldo's faith in human connection could be saved from a similar fate. It was this thought that drove Mauricio forward, pushing through the crowds with determined grace, his badge held high and his heart heavy with the weight of necessary truths. As he approached Gate 23, time seemed to slow. The scene before him unfolded like a photograph being developed. Security teams converging from all directions, the startled faces of genuine travelers, the professional mask of the scammer cracking as he realized his carefully laid plans were dissolving. And in the center of it all, Geraldo, still standing, still holding his roses, his expression caught between hope and dawning horror. Mauricio knew that what happened in the next few minutes would determine far more than the success or failure of a security operation. It would determine whether an elderly man's capacity for trust and love would survive this betrayal. The weight of this responsibility pressed against his chest with each step, but he didn't falter. Sometimes, he reminded himself, the most important part of security work had nothing to do with catching criminals. Sometimes it was about being there to catch someone when their world started to fall apart. The scene erupted into controlled chaos as the security teams moved in with practiced efficiency. The male subject with the newspaper attempted to blend into the crowd, but was quickly intercepted by two officers disguised as maintenance workers. The woman with the briefcase made a more dramatic attempt at escape, dropping her prop and trying to sprint toward the nearest exit, only to find her path blocked by airport police who had been strategically positioned minutes earlier. But it was the third subject, the one who had approached Geraldo directly, whose capture drew Mauricio's immediate attention. As the man attempted to back away smoothly, maintaining his professional demeanor even as the trap closed around him, Mauricio caught a glimpse of something that made his blood boil. A practiced look of sympathy on the scammer's face, as if he were still trying to manipulate Geraldo's emotions even in the moment of his capture. The roses trembled in Geraldo's hands as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The petals, now brown at the edges, seemed to curl inward as if trying to protect themselves from the harsh truth unfolding around them. Mauricio reached him just as the first tear slipped down his cheek, a silent testament to Dream. As crumbling in real time. "Mr. Mendez," Mauricio said softly, placing a gentle hand on the elderly man's shoulder. "Please come with me. Let's find somewhere quiet to talk." The roses fell from Geraldo's grasp, scattering their fading petals across the airport floor like the pieces of his broken heart. The scattered rose petals created a trail of crimson against the sterile airport floor as Mauricio guided Geraldo away from the commotion. Each petal seemed to mark another moment of innocence lost, another dream shattered in the harsh, fluorescent light of reality. The security officer led his charge to a private waiting room typically reserved for diplomatic visitors, its soft lighting and comfortable furnishings a stark contrast to the clinical brightness of the terminal. "Sit down, Mr. Mendez," Mauricio said gently, helping the elderly man into a plush armchair. Geraldo moved as if in a trance, his hands still curved in the shape of the roses they had held for so long. The security officer noticed they were trembling. "I don't understand," Geraldo whispered, his voice cracking. "She said, Alejandra said she would be here. She told me about her research, her love for Bach's Goldberg variations, how she played them on piano when she couldn't sleep." His words trailed off as reality began to seep through the cracks in his carefully constructed world. Mauricio pulled up a chair directly across from Geraldo, close enough to offer support, but far enough to give the man space to process. Years of security training hadn't prepared him for moments like this, when the threat wasn't physical but emotional, when the wounds couldn't be bandaged or splinted. "They were very thorough in their deception, Mr. Mendez," he explained softly. "These people, they researched their targets carefully. They probably found your posts about classical music online, used that information to create a persona they knew would appeal to you. Everything they told you was carefully crafted to build trust and emotional connection." Geraldo's hands finally stilled, coming to rest in his lap. 2 years, he said, his voice hollow. "For 2 years, I shared everything with her. My thoughts, my dreams, my fears. I told her about Maria." "Maria?" Mauricio asked quietly. "My wife. She passed away 5 years ago." Geraldo's eyes filled with tears. "Alejandra. She said she understood the pain of loss. Said she'd lost her husband to the same illness that she was fighting. We would talk for hours about grief, about learning to live again." His voice broke completely. Was any of it real? The question hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. Mauricio leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "The feelings you had were real, Mr. Mendez. The compassion, the desire to help, the capacity to love again. Those all came from you. They were genuine and valuable. These criminals, they didn't create those qualities in you. They exploited them." A sob escaped Geraldo's throat, raw and painful. I feel so foolish. All those hours talking about Bach, about literature, about life. I thought I'd found someone who understood me, who saw me as more than just an old man waiting to die. His hands clenched into fists. The money doesn't matter. It's the dreams they stole that hurt the most. Mauricio watched as the proud man before him crumbled, decades of dignity giving way to the crushing weight of betrayal. Each tear that fell seemed to carry away another memory, now tainted by deception. Every shared confidence, every late-night conversation, every plan for a future that had never existed. I keep thinking about the little things, Geraldo continued, his voice barely above a whisper. She said her favorite flowers were red roses. Said they reminded her of the gardens her grandmother kept in Buenos Aires. I spent hours choosing these ones, making sure they were perfect. He gestured helplessly at his empty hands. 3 days I waited, 3 days holding those roses, imagining her face when she saw them. How could I be so blind? The security officer felt his own eyes burning. In his career, he dealt with numerous fraud cases, but there was something particularly cruel about this type of deception. Physical valuables could be replaced, but how did one restore faith in human connection? How did you convince someone to trust again after such a profound betrayal? Mr. Mendez, Mauricio said firmly, waiting until the elderly man met his eyes. I need you to understand something. The people we caught today, they're professionals. They do this for a living. They've perfected the art of manipulation, of finding good people's vulnerabilities and exploiting them. Your only crime was having a heart open enough to love again. The words seemed to reach something in Geraldo. He straightened slightly in his chair, a flicker of his natural dignity returning. What happens now? He asked, his voice steadier. Now, we file a report. We document everything, every message, every call, every detail you can remember. Our cybercrimes unit will trace their network, find out if they're connected to other cases. Mauricio paused, then continued more gently. And we get you some support. There are counselors who specialize in helping victims of romance fraud. People who understand that the emotional damage often runs deeper than the financial loss. Victims. Geraldo repeated the word as if tasting it, his face twisting with a mix of shame and anger. Is that what I am now? A victim? You're a survivor, Mauricio corrected firmly. And you're not alone. These criminals target thousands of people every year. Educated people, successful people, people from all walks of life. The shame belongs to them, not to their targets. A long silence followed, broken only by the muffled sounds of the airport beyond their quiet room. Mauricio watched as Geraldo processed everything, noting how the man's shoulders gradually began to straighten, how his breathing steadied despite the occasional hitching sob. I kept all our messages, Geraldo finally said, pulling out his phone with hands that trembled less now. Every email, every text. I even printed some of them. He gave a bitter laugh. I thought they'd be something to show our grandchildren someday. Proof that love can bloom even in winter. Mauricio nodded encouragingly. Those messages will help our investigation. But more importantly, Mr. Mendez, they'll help you heal. Sometimes understanding how we were deceived is the first step toward making sure it never happens again. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the airport windows in shades of orange and gold. Geraldo watched the changing light, his face reflecting both loss and dawning resolution. You know what hurts the most? He asked quietly. Not the money, not even the lies about her feelings. It's that they took my memories of Maria and used them to build their trap. Every time I shared a story about her, they were just taking notes, creating their character. The security officer felt a surge of protective anger. They had no right to do that, Mr. Mendez. No right at all. But they couldn't taint those memories unless you let them. Your love for Maria, your willingness to open your heart again, those things are yours. They belong to you, not to them. Geraldo nodded slowly, tears still falling, but his voice stronger now. I suppose I need to learn the difference between keeping my heart open and leaving it unguarded. That's very wise, Mauricio said softly. And you won't have to learn that alone. I promise you that. As the last rays of sunlight painted the room in gentle gold, Mauricio realized that his shift had ended hours ago. But looking at the elderly man across from him, broken but not destroyed, wounded but beginning to heal, he knew he wouldn't leave until he was sure Geraldo had all the support he needed. Sometimes security meant more than protecting people from physical harm. Sometimes it meant being present in the moments when they had to rebuild their sense of safety from the ground up. As Geraldo began to share his story in more detail, each word seeming to lift a small weight from his shoulders, Mauricio settled in to listen. The scattered rose petals might be swept away by the airport's cleaning crew, but the lessons they represented would linger long after this night was over. As night settled over Silver Winds Airport, the fluorescent lights seemed to soften, as if understanding the delicate nature of the scene unfolding in the diplomatic waiting room. Mauricio had called Elena to handle the necessary paperwork, and she arrived with a quiet efficiency that spoke of years handling sensitive situations. She brought not just official forms, but also coffee, water, and small sandwiches, a thoughtful touch that made Geraldo's eyes mist over again. "You are all so kind," he said, accepting a cup of coffee with hands that had finally stopped shaking. "I don't deserve such consideration after being so foolish." "Mr. Mendez," Elena interjected gently, her dark eyes warm with compassion. "In the past month alone, we've seen doctors, lawyers, and even a retired psychology professor fall victim to similar scams. Intelligence and education are no protection against skilled manipulators who target the heart rather than the mind." As they worked through the statement forms, Geraldo's story emerged in greater detail. The scammers had been meticulous in their approach, building their deception like master architects constructing a cathedral of lies. Every stone had been carefully placed, every support beam calculated for maximum emotional impact. "It started with Bach," Geraldo explained, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I had commented on a classical music forum about the emotional complexity of the Goldberg variations. She, or whoever was pretending to be her, responded with such insight. We discussed the way the aria returns at the end, how it feels both the same and fundamentally changed by all that has come before." Mauricio listened intently, noting how the scammers had used this genuine connection to classical music as a foundation for their fraud. They had taken Geraldo's passionate analysis of Bach's work and twisted it into a metaphor for their fictional relationship, something beautiful returning in a new form. The medical condition was introduced so gradually. Geraldo continued, shaking his head at his own blindness. First, just casual mentions of fatigue affecting her piano practice. Then discussions of experimental treatments, stories about medical research careers cut short by illness. They build it piece by piece like a variation on a theme. Mauricio supplied softly, earning a sharp look of recognition from Geraldo. "Yes, exactly like that." Each new detail harmonized perfectly with what came before. There were never any discordant notes, nothing to make me question the melody they were creating. The elderly man's hands moved as if conducting an invisible orchestra, then fell still in his lap. Until today, when the music stopped, and I realized I had been listening to a recording rather than a live performance. Elena, who had been quietly documenting everything, looked up from her tablet. "Mr. Mendez, your insights are incredibly valuable. The way you're breaking down their methodology, it will help us protect others from similar schemes." This seemed to straighten Geraldo's shoulders somewhat. The idea that his pain might serve a greater purpose appeared to give him strength. He began to speak more freely, detailing the countless small ways the scammers had built their illusion of intimacy. They knew exactly when to push and when to pull back, he explained. When I expressed concern about sending money, Alejandro would become distant, apologetic, insisting she couldn't accept help. It made me pursue her, convince her to let me assist. They turned my own generosity into a weapon against me. Mauricio watched as understanding dawned in Geraldo's eyes, not just of how he had been deceived, but of how his finest qualities had been used against him. His compassion, his cultural sophistication, his desire to help others. All had been carefully noted and exploited. "You know," Geraldo said suddenly, turning to look out at the now dark airport terminal, "I keep thinking about those roses. 3 days I held them, watching them slowly die in my hands. It feels like a metaphor now, beauty and hope withering while I refuse to see reality. Elena reached out and touched his hand briefly. But you didn't let go of them until the very end. That says something about faith, about the capacity to believe in beauty even when it's fading. That's not weakness, Mr. Mendez. That's courage. The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Mauricio watched as Geraldo absorbed them, noting how the man's expression shifted from shame to something closer to acceptance. I need to tell my daughter, Geraldo said abruptly, his voice catching. Sophia, she lives in Canada with her family. She's been asking me to move closer to them, but I've been resistant. Told her I had found happiness here, that I was building a new life. He pressed his hands to his eyes. How do I tell her that her father has been such a fool? You tell her the truth, Mauricio said firmly. That you are a man of deep feeling and genuine compassion who was targeted by professional criminals. That you're hurt but healing, wiser but not broken. And most importantly, that you're ready to focus on the real relationships in your life. A heavy silence fell over the room as Geraldo processed these words. Outside, the airport's nighttime cleaning crew was moving through the terminal, their machines humming softly as they erased the day's traces. Somewhere out there, the scattered rose petals were being swept away, returning the floor to its usual pristine state. But the memories, both painful and instructive, would remain. Would one of you stay with me while I call her? Geraldo asked, his voice small but determined. I don't think I can face this conversation alone. Of course, Elena responded immediately, while Mauricio nodded his agreement. We'll be right here. As Geraldo pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, Mauricio reflected on the strange turns life could take. He had started his shift expecting another routine day of security checks and lost luggage reports. Instead, he had become witness to both the darkness and light of human nature, the cruelty of those who would exploit love for profit, and the resilience of those who could learn to love again even after betrayal. The phone began to ring in Geraldo's hand, and Mauricio saw him straighten, gathering his courage. Whatever came next would be difficult, but it would be real. No more digital phantoms or carefully crafted lies. Just a father reaching out to his daughter, ready to begin the long journey back to genuine connection. Sophia answered on the third ring, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet room. Papa? Is everything okay? It's so late there? Geraldo took a deep breath, and Mauricio saw in that moment not a victim, but a survivor preparing to take his first steps toward healing. The roses might be gone, their petals scattered and swept away, but the capacity for growth, like the return of Bach's aria in the Goldberg variations, remained, changed but undiminished by all that had come before. Sophia, Minna Filha, Geraldo began, his voice wavering but determined. I need to tell you something important. He paused, gathering strength from the supportive presence of Mauricio and Elena beside him. Something has happened, and I need your help. The story spilled out in halting Portuguese, each word seeming to lift a small weight from Geraldo's shoulders while simultaneously adding to the palpable concern in his daughter's voice. Mauricio, understanding the language from his own Brazilian heritage, watched as the elderly man navigated the delicate waters between confession and reassurance. No, I'm safe, Geraldo insisted, responding to his daughter's frightened questions. I'm with airport security officers. They stopped something terrible from happening. His eyes met Mauricio's, filled with a mixture of gratitude and lingering shame. They saved more than just my money, Sophia. They saved my dignity. Through the speaker, Sophia's voice carried the sharp edge of protective anger mixed with relief. I'm booking a flight right now, Papa. Lucas can handle the clinic for a few days. I'll be there as soon as possible. You don't need to dash, Geraldo began, but his daughter cut him off with the gentle authority that adult children sometimes develop with aging parents. I want a Papa, and I think you need me to, even if you won't admit it. There was a pause, filled with the soft sounds of typing. I can be there by tomorrow evening. Just promise me you'll stay with someone tonight? I don't want you alone in that big house. Before Geraldo could respond, Mauricio leaned forward slightly. Mr. Mendez, my sister Angela runs a small guest house near the airport. It's comfortable, quiet, and she's a trained nurse. If you'd like, I could arrange for you to stay there until your daughter arrives. The relief on Geraldo's face was immediate and profound. Sophia? The security officer, Mauricio. He's offered a safe place for me to stay. A guest house run by his sister. Thank God, Sophia's voice cracked slightly. Yes, please, Papa. Accept his help. Another pause, shorter this time. Flight booked. I'll land at 7:45 tomorrow evening. Will you? Will you wait for me at the airport? A shadow passed over Geraldo's face at the mention of airport waiting, but Mauricio spoke up quickly. We'll arrange for you to meet in the private security lounge, Miss Sophia. Much more comfortable than the public terminal. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with practical details being arranged amidst expressions of love and concern. When Geraldo finally ended the call, he seemed both exhausted and somehow lighter, as if sharing his burden had already begun the healing process. She's a doctor, you know, he said softly, pocketing his phone. A pediatrician, always taking care of others, just like her mother. His voice caught on the last word. Maria would be so disappointed in me. No, Elena interjected firmly, speaking for the first time since the call began. Your wife would be proud that you still had the capacity to love, to trust, to try to help others. The people who deceived you, they're the only ones who should feel shame. Mauricio nodded in agreement, already pulling out his own phone. Let me call Angela about the room. She'll be happy to help. He stepped away briefly to make the arrangement, hearing Geraldo continue to talk softly with Elena about his family. Lucas, Sophia's husband, he's a good man. A surgeon. They've been trying to convince me to move to Canada for years now. Geraldo's voice carried a mix of regret and hope. Maybe it's time to listen to them. When Mauricio returned, Angela had already prepared a room and offered to make her special chamomile tea, a gesture that brought fresh tears to Geraldo's eyes. So much kindness, he murmured. After everything, still so much kindness in the world. As they gathered their things to leave the airport, Mauricio noticed Geraldo pause, looking back toward Gate 23, where his 3-day vigil had finally ended. The cleaning crews had finished their work. No trace remained of the scattered rose petals that had marked his moment of disillusionment. You know, Geraldo said thoughtfully, in the Goldberg Variations, Bach takes a simple aria and transforms it through 30 variations, each one exploring different aspects of the original theme. UT in the end, the aria returns, unchanged yet somehow more meaningful for all that has come before. He turned to Mauricio with a wan smile. Perhaps that's what this is, a variation in my life's music. Painful, yes, but maybe necessary for the next movement to begin. The security officer felt something tighten in his chest at the elderly man's ability to find meaning even in his pain. Mr. Mendez, I think you understand Bach better than any scammer ever could. Together, they walked through the quiet terminal, their footsteps echoing in the near-empty space. The night shift workers nodded respectfully as they passed, the airport's perpetual machinery humming softly in the background. Outside, the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars, promising that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn. As they approached Mauricio's car, Geraldo stopped suddenly. The roses, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I never got to give them to anyone. All that hope, that love, just scattered on the floor and swept away. Mauricio helped him into the passenger seat before responding. Tomorrow, after you've rested, we can stop at a flower shop. You can choose new roses, not for a stranger this time, but for Sophia. Real flowers for real love. Geraldo's eyes welled up again, but this time his tears seemed cleansing rather than devastating. Yes, he whispered. Real flowers for real love. That's where the music begins again, isn't it? As they drove through the night toward Angela's guest house, Mauricio thought about Bach's Goldberg Variations, about love and deception, about roses that withered and those yet to bloom. The aria would return, different yet the same, carried on the wings of a daughter's love and a father's courage to begin again. Behind them, Silver Winds Airport continued its eternal rhythm of arrivals and departures, each one carrying its own story of endings and beginnings, while somewhere in the night, a cleaning crew's garbage bag held the faded petals of 3 days' worth of hope. Not lost, but transformed, like Boxaria, into something new and unexpectedly profound.